You're listening to a Very Spatial podcast, episode 706, January 1st, 2023.
Hello and welcome to a Very Spatial podcast. I'm Jesse.
I'm Sue.
I'm Barb.
And this is Frank.
And this week we're doing our annual tradition of looking at the year that we have just gone through. And instead of doing two separate episodes, we've, in the last few years, been doing a little bit of prognostication at the end of the episode. Though the prognostication has become less, I think.
I think because the more we do this, the more we realize we're not future readers of the world.
Well,
we're not futurists.
Or we're looking too far out for what's going to be. Because, I mean, how many years did it take us to be right about location-based services?
Yeah, I think it's more that. It's like, I could look at all these things, but I've said this before. And probably what I'll say this time will be, it'd be more hope than prognostication. Because that's what I think I've had the last couple times.
So where do we want to begin? Because there's lots of things we can talk about. We can talk about data. We can talk about software. We can talk about hardware. Is there any general direction we want to start from?
I would like to highlight one of my favorite things to talk about in the podcast, that this was a banner year for NASA and space things. Space things, again, they tangentially touch up against geography, but I like reporting on them. But just amazing stuff that went on. So, for example, although it was launched, I think it was launched December 2021, we got to see this year the first pictures from the James Webb Space Telescope. So that was pretty amazing.
Landsat 9 went live. And
Correct.
Data.
So that's kind of remote sensing spacey. We had the DART mission. I forget what the D stands for, but it's Asteroid Redirection Test. Yeah, and that was successful. What does the D stand for? I can look it up. Then we had the Artemis mission. So after, several scrubs of the launch, and a lot of this happening in the fall, that was successful. So Artemis 1 launched and completed its mission as well. And then on the last little note related to space stuff, it's kind of a bittersweet note, is that in the last couple of weeks, the InSight lander was declared end of mission. So very sad. And with a very sad social media, because NASA, of course, has been masters at the social media with their missions. But the I'm losing power, it was super sad. I think I saved it. But another amazing mission on the surface of Mars. And so that one is just kind of a bittersweet thing, but marking a kind of a milestone there. So I think that, and I'm probably missing some of the stuff, but I think that this year NASA has just had amazing missions, amazing science, and the Landsat, and just looking forward to what they're going to be doing next. So that's one I definitely wanted to get in here for this year is all that they've done.
Well, it's not just NASA, right? You also have China finishing out the Beidou-2 satellite system. You have ESA continue to launch Galileo satellites. You have Japan, who launched, is it a moon reconnaissance or moon lander?
It's a moon mission.
Yeah,
it's a moon mission. And
it was kind of, I think, a little, I don't know if it's just in Western news reporting or what. It was just hazy. It was never clear to me on that in the news reports, which is, I thought that was really odd.
Yeah. China continues its installation for its next space station. So yeah, lots of things going around the world for space stuff.
And I think, like Sue said, it is part of that social media that NASA and others are doing, that it was a banner year for science communication and related to remote sensing and geography and geospatial. You just saw a lot of that humanization of these things that were going on. And you saw there were a lot more cartoons this year related to the satellites, a lot more of just talk about it in the general public than I've seen in past years.
And that's good, again, keeping that awareness. And there's new missions that are coming up. I think Landsat Next has got a number of years of development yet, so that one is not in the near horizon, but some other missions are getting ready. And also, I think we're going to be seeing more countries get into this again. And not rely on systems that maybe are from the U.S. So I think I've seen that a couple of countries are looking at regional equivalents to GPS again, or building those up and launching some other Earth observation satellites on their own. So I think that we're going to see, and are already in the planning stages for launches in that sense. And on the opposite end, in remote sensing, we're seeing the CubeSat phenomenon evolving.
Well, commercial in general, whether CubeSats being government or personal or commercial, we're seeing a huge expansion in the space area of commercial aspects. We have startups, we have, traditional companies all pushing, not to be too Star Trekian, the frontier of, what we're doing and what we can do, both in terms of communication, Earth observation, all these different things that we use satellites for.
Yeah, and we've talked about that a couple of years in the past, for sure, that the recognition of how remote sensing of other wavelengths of light, besides just the visible, which had been, driving the early commercial push, but how that's expanding, and just a recognition of the use of that data as well, and the value of that data.
So I'm going to go in a very different direction for the thing that I liked a lot that happened this year. And is as momentous as exploring spaces. This is as minuscule as you can get, but it was fairly momentous for a lot of our community, which is, I feel like 2022 was the first year the GIS community said, you know what, ArcMap, it is going away. It's going away, and we and that's okay, and we can let it go. We can just let it be what it was and move on. There was a few things of the educational side of things that made a huge difference in the re-up in June for most people. I think that's true. They stopped giving out ArcMap licenses to educational community. You had to get, by default, you had to ask for them. You had to say, I need this, and you could get it. You can no longer get the student editions, so students weren't getting exposed to this. And this is kind of weird, I realized, because an awful lot of people were really ahead of the curve and jumped on Arc Pro early on and moved everything to that. But at least here in West Virginia and a lot of the expert community that I talked to, there seemed to be a good, proper embracement of Arc Pro and moving on to the new wave of things in a way that just kind of wasn't there before. I don't want to blame COVID, but I'm going to blame COVID. I think that insanity made people go, I don't have the brain power to deal with a new thing. And so a lot of them didn't jump on it. But I think in 2022, that crest finally broke, and we've moved on from ArcMap, and we've released it into the annals of history. And that's awesome, because I don't like ArcMap, but I do like Arc Pro.
I will say that we made the jump. So yeah, I guess on a micro scale, the jump has been made in our educational setting. And so yes, our new students will no longer be exposed to the older, but ArcMap had its life, and it
was a good life.
Yeah,
and
did a lot of amazing things. The whole suite of the desktop. So, and you still can use it. And there are many out there that still do, but yeah, I think I would agree that in a small way, others that I know have made that transition now as well, that are in that ecosystem.
And I think one of the things about this year is the word transition, because I think things like that did help. A lot of the meetings I've gone to and trainings and things, especially being able to do them virtually, they just talked about this transition that we're moving into, a new phase, is, as we go through up and downs and phases, but this is the next phase. And I think we saw a lot of those transitions.
And so we're seeing a lot of people, not just, within the ARC Esri sphere moving, but, we're seeing people, moving from the Esri sphere into more of the open source sphere. We do have a lot more packages out there, a lot more proprietary packages out there besides Esri's. Some of them we don't hear as much about as we did whenever we started the podcast, because they're becoming less of the forefront. So GeoMedia is less of a focus, I think, for Hexagon Geospatial. Hexagon can let me know if I'm wrong on that, but they seem to be focusing a lot more on the remote sensing, and especially with the newer products that they've been bringing in over the last couple of years in terms of the 3D point clouds and things like that. Map info, once it got consumed into Pitney Bowes, and then did it get spun back out? But still, we don't hear a lot about map info anymore like we did whenever we first started the podcast 15 years ago. But, there are a lot of other commercial products, so many that I'm blanking on all of them right now, that, give you opportunities to work in the desktop environment. And that doesn't even go into the server environment where, it's not about one individual product most of the time. It's about pulling together the different products, both commercial and open source, to get what you want out there. So it's an evolving, the transitions that we have in the industry.
So here's a question for a future podcast. I think it's an interesting topic, but I was asked this a couple weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, something like that, and I didn't know the answer. What would be the open source equivalent of Portal? And it's just something we can kick around later, but that's kind of, Portal has become, and ArcGIS Online has become a lot more dominant, and a lot of the things that I've interacted with in the last 12 months. And it did have that question, well, how would you do this if you didn't want to go with an Esri solution? What would that look like? And I think that's an interesting question to kick around. But
there's a lot of pieces that would be involved. And I don't think there is a single source.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's an interesting question, but I think it does speak to the broader question of the geospatial landscape is evolving quite significantly to be much more complex and move away from a single desktop thing. And I think that was, for some reason, that just seemed to get momentum, or the gestalt happened in 2022, at least from my perception.
One of the things, so we've talked about some of the desktop GIS things. We talked about space. What else did we have this year?
We had a lot of ocean mapping. We have the really ambitious plan to map the ocean. There was a large focus on that and having the technologies to do it now.
I was trying to remember, I'm blanking on it now. There's another thing, not oceans, but there was another area that is evolving. Is it elevation? It's the NHD. NHD is officially going away, and it's being replaced by something else that was announced this year.
The National Hydrological Data Set?
Yeah, they're retiring it and they're replacing it with, I cannot remember what it is, but they're evolving it to a new direction. And the National Elevation Data Set similarly has moved officially, and I'm not sure if that happened in 2021 or the beginning of 2022, but is officially moved to the 3DEP program. So these national data sets in the United States, and I'm certain this is happening in other countries as well, are starting to embrace sort of the new generation, the new way, how can we build on this and move forward. And I think that's an important thing that's good that we need to do constantly. But it seemed to happen a bunch in 2022.
So whenever we're talking about data, of course, we have changes. We did see not just elevation and hydrology changes in data sets, the soils. Again, not a recent thing, but it in the United States and now in many other countries as well has moved much more to a raster product than the traditional vector products. I don't know. I mean, there's so many changes in those type of data sets. And, whenever we're talking about data, going back to where we kind of started with the space data sets, we keep seeing better resolutions in our Earth observation data sets. So again, Landsat 9 followed with Landsat 8's same duration of return, but of course having two of them at that resolution means that you cut it in half. We're still talking about very high 16-bit depth on the images as opposed to our traditional 8-bit images. Yeah, I mean, it's just so much that's going on in terms of changes in the government and the commercial side of data acquisition. So we just keep getting more and more and more and more data. So this whole idea of information literacy that we were talking about being overwhelmed by, 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago. Now we're getting to the point where we have so much imagery data coming in and so much data being generated from that. We're being overwhelmed by the volume of data we have access to.
And I think, so this is falling, and actually this was going to lead into what I'm probably going to later say in my, not prognostication, but hopes for the future, is that in addition, some of the innovations that we've seen are prompting now decisions on use and interface, or perhaps those thoughts. So for example, all of this availability now of higher resolution remote sensing data means that you have to be able to serve it in a platform that can ingest it and use it. So that means higher end hardware. And when we see the move, so for example, the release of the SDKs for Unity and Unreal Engine from ArcGIS, that now you have to decide for those types of things and that immersive work. So it's this push towards using a lot of data sets for more immersive, higher resolution visualizations and daily uses. But on that end of it, they require much more hardware. And so that's still potentially limiting. But on the other hand, we're seeing, that real push in the online space and the mobile space, in those spaces, to have data out there. And those devices have, at least for now, different needs. And so I think it's interesting that, you have these kind of now new potential paths you have to go and focus on with your own work. Am I going into the immersive space? And if so, I have different needs, and perhaps that's spurring changes in that. And so that's, in the future sense. But right now, for example, if you want to leverage some of that stuff, those high resolution, big data sets, and you want to see them in a visualization environment, like in, a 3D space, or you want to utilize the game engines, you need to have hardware that can do it. And so that's not potentially for everybody yet, but it's a push, I think, that a lot of people want to see and maybe work with. And, conversely, seeing a lot more push to have things online, to have more functionality online, so you can pull it into different devices and actually, run a buffer online or things like that. So I think that's an interesting tension there, because for a lot of the sort of cutting edge stuff, it always has been in one direction or another a question of, which is going first? Is the content versus the device to actually interact with it, or the platform. I guess it's probably a better word than device, but the platform to interact with it. So, I'm seeing some of those things this year that, really might make for some decisions that organizational people have to make. Like, do I want to invest in going in this direction with this technology? Because what I have and I'm working with now probably may not get the job done anymore.
So related to that, something that happened this year, that was kind of interesting, is two things happened in the non-geospatial realm that impacts the geospatial realm significantly. And I think it's very fascinating. And I think that kind of hopefully starts peeling back some of the insular nature that we think about this stuff. The first off is that the complete and utter collapse of cryptocurrency. And so suddenly all of this hardware that you're talking about, a big reason that people weren't investing in it is because it was so damn expensive to buy a graphics card, because people were buying them up at well over MSRP because they were using them in cryptocurrency mining. For the first time in maybe 3 years, I want to say 2 years, certainly.
Safe,
yeah. You can get graphics card at basically what they cost, and
sometimes less.
Sometimes less. I mean, it's back to the market we were used to 10 years ago in terms of hardware. So you can make those decisions in a meaningful sense and say, yeah, I can go in this direction if I want to use GPUs for something, because I can actually get one. And it won't cost me an arm and a leg. I won't spend one amount of money for the computer for everything, and then spend 1, 2, sometimes 3 times that much for the graphics card alone to do this stuff. So that allows equations that couldn't have happened a year and a half ago. Similarly, I think we're not going to see the fallout. This somewhat gets into the future stuff. I'm not sure we're going to see all the fallout, but some of the data stuff that we're seeing, the explosion of data, is somewhat, in my opinion, connected to the automated car phenomenon, because there was a whole lot of technology and money thrown at research to make new techniques, new technologies, new devices, make what we have better, cheaper, more robust. So cars could use them for automated driving, and that collapsed as well. That's just this year, they kind of figured out that's going to happen. It's not real soon. And we have other things we need to focus on, like EVs. So I think there's going to be a massive de-investment in that stuff. And I kind of hope that, again, we're moving to the future sort of talk here, but I kind of hope that the massive amount of technological change that happened to make automated cars, the geospatial industry suddenly has a plethora of toys that can start figuring out how to utilize that stuff more efficiently and not require the constant creation of new stuff.
Counter your second point and agree with your first point. Countering is, yes, you're correct, but I think that we're not talking about the complete automation anymore, but we're seeing still more sensors and more data capabilities and more cars. So that I think is going to continue. And so that data stream is still going to continue to grow. But yes, it's not about figuring out the true deep learning and machine learning aspects of making sure it's not going to run over somebody. It's just helping the driver still, as opposed to what we were looking for a year ago. So I think the data is still going to be coming through, and that'll really be good. And on the second one, the first one, because I was doing it backwards, in addition to GPUs becoming more available for the end user, so at the user end of things, we also continue to see Amazon Web Services, Azure, Microsoft Azure, and even small third-party, if you want to call them that, or not giant, data centers offering GPUs and servers. And so we're seeing, as Sue started to talk about, there's a lot more of off-lay from the desktop into the server space. So we're kind of heading back into the 90s where we were,
or earlier.
Everything, and even earlier, where everything lived on servers and we were living on those thin clients. And we've been like that with the mobile devices. But I think we're getting more robust in what we can do on those back ends now because they're being built out. And in a lot of ways, it's decentralizing these 3D graphics. It's decentralizing the need for high CPU capabilities to run data, because whenever you can have something that's working across either 5 cores or 1,000 cores, depending on what you need, and then it'll shift in real time, you don't have to worry about what you have on the desktop, and you can do much more robust activities in terms of analysis and generation of data. So yeah, I think both of those are places where we're going to see a lot more data continue to come from.
And along with all that, one of the things I was thinking was, a lot of this has to do with outcomes. And this year we've seen from the outcomes of that convergence of data and technology so many times when we've seen, especially the world, totally differently. I'm thinking about, the glaciers and glaciology, and then, volcanology and what happened with a lot of the recent eruptions, that it totally was a game changer for like what we thought we knew and what we thought was happening. And it had accelerated some of what people had thought in the past, purely based on having that data, having the drones, having the ability to finally get this knowledge, and outcome in a lot of other areas, from small municipalities to commercialization. I think we'll just see more of that, more big revelations that come out from what we thought we knew.
We have so many sensors out there now that are passively collecting data. I mean, yeah, we have ones like the GPS units that are sitting on the edges of volcanoes and, specific sensors that are in streams. But there's so many sensors that we have that are just passively collecting all of this data that we can then utilize it. It may not be temporally as up to date as some of the direct sensors, but it's given us so much understanding about these events that Barb was talking about. It's just, things we weren't expecting to happen, we're now seeing them happen in near real time in our data sets, and we can look at them in whole new ways.
Yeah. And I think one of the questions you asked Jesse in an earlier episode was, what do you do when you can do this near real time? What does it mean? What are we going to do with it? And I think that's a future question.
Well, I think we've seen that evolution as we see more and more use cases for that type of data, right? Once you get enough of the data, then you can actually use it and see. And I think in a related note to that too, that this year was the year where I noticed that a lot of technology that we've been talking about, so, drones and those types of things, they reached that, what I think of as the ubiquity stage, where, you're seeing a lot of local news reports where they've got drone views of things going on, and they're actually utilizing, mapping services like, Google Maps or Google Earth, but they're actually using them in just hey, this is just the thing we do, and we've seen that over the last number of years. But this year was really the year where it was just like it's just something that you do. And we've kind of seen AR and other things creep in as well. And so I think that's it, right? Is that the combination, as we've talked about in the past, like when you have the data there and you have examples to see how you might apply it, then you see that broad adoption. I think this year was a year where I noticed that quite a bit in lots of different situations.
So let's talk about a big geography thing that happened this year. Obviously, the invasion of Ukraine. That was February 2022. Now, arguably, this has been going on since 2014, I think, when Crimea was first invaded. But the proper invasion of Ukraine was February 2022, and that's an ongoing conflict, and that's, a big deal. That's a major geography-related event that happened this year.
Yeah, geopolitical, and, highlighting a lot of the consequence of a lot of forces and process that have been going on really for decades, a lot longer than just sort of the precipitating, but how those things still impact.
Yeah, but it brought up questions for, open source, open data. It also brought up questions when you were talking about remote sensing, especially with agriculture, when people were watching and looking at the logistics. So again, that convergence of what we knew and the technology we have now, being able to highlight things that we wouldn't have seen before in almost real time.
So what do we think is going to be 2023's banner year stuff?
I'm gonna go with one that I think I've gone with a couple times now in the last few years, but maybe I'm seeing, and others are seeing, that there's a little bit more of an uptick, and that is wanting and perhaps seeing the VR space expand out a little bit. And my reasoning for that is we've seen, I think, some success with things like the Quest 2 and devices. We've seen applications that are coming through where people are actually adopting. I don't think we're there yet with a broad use case, but this dovetails into what I was talking about with that combination of wanting to have immersive, high-resolution stuff, which we see in things like the game engines and stuff, but on the other side, having to deliver to devices that don't necessarily have the capabilities to display them, but want that experience. And I think that it's probably a more hopeful thing is that VR maybe is starting to build up enough steam where there will be seen as use cases to make that investment to try to figure out. So the new Pro device from the Quest series, the Quest Pro might be down there, because this has always been a space where the technology is definitely perhaps limiting people's imagination. So it's not as much a prediction as maybe a hope that we might be seeing some things in the coming year or even 2 years where we're maybe getting over some of those humps.
Well, we already have the expectation that Apple's going to finally release theirs. We've seen in the last few months some questions, especially the last month, some questions about Meta's, aka MetaQuest Pro, MetaQuest 2, their stability in terms of longevity in this space. And so people are beginning to question, they thought they were going to be the leader, but even right now, I think those of us who look at this in the commercial space are saying, okay, Microsoft's already there, Apple's going to be there for the not necessarily commercial, but definitely the consumer. So yeah, I think there's questions right now about where we're going and who's going to be leading that. And I think that announcement earlier this year of the I just forgot the name of it, but the Metaverse working group is what I'm going to call it. But we talked about it basically back in July, August, whenever they first announced all the people who are going to be part of it. And it's everybody except for Apple who is a member of it. It's Microsoft, it's Meta, it's Esri, it's we can keep going down the list of all these companies that are going to be involved with making this idea of the metaverse or whatever it will be, come to reality. And so we have a path forward, but I agree that it's more of a hope right now than it is a destination, because there's just not that good commercial aspect to it.
I think that's it, right? And I think that different people bring different perspectives to the table, and this and I'm not as much up on this. Frank probably knows more about this than me, but I think it's that question is, how do you, if you're going to be commercially viable, and as we know, that's what's going to drive this sort of thing, is, what's the pathway? Is it the end consumer, or in the days of PCs and things like that, is it really the business side that you have to convince, because they'll make a huge investment and that'll get you through, and then you kind of spread out to the broad users. And so there's kind of been this back and forth. So Microsoft tried to go, I think, the business route with the HoloLens, which was has lots of potential. It had some uses.
Magic Leap as well.
What's that?
Magic Leap as well.
Yes, correct. And then, the Quest 2, that route was the commercial route. And there is, of course, a barrier here. So my hope is, because there is, in the case of the VR, there is actually also a physical sort of ergonomic question, in that not everybody can use the devices because of, vertigo, whatever it is might be the thing, and the motion sickness and stuff. So there is a little side thing there, but I don't think that's the huge thing. But maybe that contributes to a drive for a different interface somehow. But I do think that the desires that we've seen from more and more data, near real-time data, higher resolution data, and the desire to visualize it, right, I think is that gives us many, many reasons to want to be able to get over this hump of virtual reality, perhaps. But we're just not quite there. So I'm kind of hopeful and curious if this year or the next 2 years we'll see some sort of cracking of that. But I do think that the metaverse thing got off to a rocky start in its current iteration, because A, it wasn't brand new, and B, again, trying to drive it top down is always, as with any of these things, always runs into issues.
And Sue, I'm going with yours, but not VR, is the question of the top down and the commercialization, which I don't know, Maxar recently, a very solid company, one that's well respected for imagery. I think it was recently consolidated in or bought out. It's changed. And I think we're going to be seeing more of that in the coming year. And I'm not really sure what that means or what's going to happen. It does show that, like Jesse said, a lot of companies that are out there are very interested in what's going on in the geospatial realm and are wanting to get involved. And that could mean a lot of, big changes for things such as the VR technology and other things that people use. So I've got some expectations to see more. I just don't know what it means and if it's going to impact anything, if at all.
We can continue to see consolidation. Since you mentioned Maxar, of course, it wasn't a new consolidation by any means, but of course they bought Digital Globe a couple of years ago, and so we've seen a lot of the contracts coming around for renewal for Digital Globe's original contracts, and Maxar, of course, has been winning those again. So it's whenever we see all these companies consolidating, it doesn't mean that we're losing options, because there's so many more startups coming up as well. It does mean that we have these larger, massive companies like Airbus and Maxar who are kind of dominating, especially the remote sensing space right now.
Well, and I think in the remote sensing space, I've found out that quite a bit of capital is required, all right, to design, as in previous conversations we had about remote sensing satellites, right? The amount of capital required to design, build, and launch and maintain a satellite has meant that often there has to be that consolidation to be able to maintain that money stream in order to operate the hardware that you're depending on.
Yeah, I think that the interesting thing for the end user, for the most part, to me, of these consolidations is how that changes that space. So I talk about when I'm in teaching in lectures, I talk about the black box, and we've talked about that hundreds of times on the podcast, is how does the black box operate? I think that one of the aspects that we don't pay a lot of attention to is the shifting black box. Okay, now I'm using this data stream because this company's consolidated with that company, and it's cheaper to utilize this bit of technology they have to produce this data, and the implications for that. This year, there was at the tail end, and I don't think we've covered this as a news item, but there was a consortium of companies that are trying to unseat Google Maps dominance. They just want to, blow it away. And it was Microsoft's one of them, and there's a few.
Mapbox is definitely up there.
Yeah,
whether they're part of that consortium or not.
I don't know. Yeah, but and so there's this movement to do that, and that's very front facing. People are going to notice. If suddenly you're not launching Google Maps, you're launching whatever. But I think that a lot of these consolidations and evolving business relationships do that on the back end without you even realizing it per se, and think that's kind of an interesting trend that has been true. Maybe the entire time we've been doing the podcast, but it's maybe a little more front-facing now. Maybe not. I don't know. Maybe it's still just as hidden as ever. But I feel like it's something we don't talk about a lot in the geospatial, side hallway conversations that we probably should be a little more cognitive of, actively cognitive that is going on.
Well, especially with data services, web services being so inherent in what we do now. Whenever, we started the podcast, you might be able to lock onto somebody's WMS or WFS server and pull down data very slowly. Now you're expected to log into ArcGIS Pro and you're going to have a base map. You literally have to go in and remove it to not have a base map in the desktop software now in that proprietary case. So this expectation of web services is just fundamental to how students are learning, especially in those proprietary cases. But even with, QGIS, you have that capability to bring in these services very easily. And a lot of times it is easier to deal with a web service than it is to download and store it on the computer. And then if somebody changes, you've got to go and download it again as opposed to just dealing with a stream. So yeah, we're going to continue to see that as an underlying issue that we're going to be facing for a long time. Is these? I don't even remember where we started. What was the last thing you said?
Well, the front facingness of these consolidations,
right? And so the web services are just kind of eating into that and just eroding our understanding of what we're working with sometimes, just because we take what there is.
A trend I think is actually going to be a 2023 thing that may go into the future, and I think it's tangentially related to geospatial industry, but it's something we should be aware of and factor in, which is the really rapidly changing nature of social media. Obviously right now there's amazing things going on in two areas that are huge for social media. One is obviously, I'm going to use the phrase from my perspective, meltdown of Twitter, that's going on for a whole lot of reasons. One major reason, but that dramatically changes a whole lot of stuff. And one of the areas that, for example, U.S. governments are dealing with, the U.S. government agencies are dealing with Twitter, is the amount of information they've launched on Twitter that, what if this is suddenly not available? How do we archive it? How do we get it, off into something that's a little less, shifting sands than a social media platform like Twitter? Similarly, there's a great movement right now to ban TikTok in the United States because of concerns about security. And that could have massive implications for the social media landscape. Who uses what for what purposes and how it's utilized, and how do we work across, TikTok to me is a very interesting example, because I was talking with some friends about this last night, that most of the platforms now have something that's TikTok-y, if I can use that word, if I can invent that word. You've got YouTube Reels and YouTube Shorts and Facebook Reels. I can't remember whose is what's is, but they're all kind of TikTok-like. If TikTok is banned in the United States, then you get this immediate fragmentation of, if everyone agrees to embrace YouTube's and Facebook's and whoever's version of whatever that is, then some people go one way and some people go the other way and some people go a third way. And getting this into a cohesive landscape again is going to be not easy, and a little bit messy. So these are things that, again, are tangentially related to geospatial, but also directly related. If you think about like something like voluntary geographic information, we tap into these things for VGI, yet this stuff is suddenly changing, all just in a very short number of months. And I think that where we're at 12 months from now, this conversation about social media is going to look like a very different landscape in January 1st, 2024.
Yeah, and I think it's a reminder, right? But also, I do agree that it'll be curious how it shakes out. Is that the social media ethos is built on the platform is somewhat neutral and everyone contributes on it, right? The platform just facilitates what's going on, but it was a forgetting that the platforms are being stood up by commercial entities, and when that you can get entities that aren't going to make decisions that are for the good of all. And so in that security issue, but also the idea that this data is desirable and not having a social media presence now. So that's it, right? So how this landscape will change is a detriment, right? Not being there, but trying to figure out where that's going to go. So I think that those are really good examples of, what can happen is the platform can go away. And also if you're contributing on the platform and you're getting information, you make an agreement, and whether you're government or not, you make an agreement, right? That there are certain things that platform owner can do with your data that you basically agree to. And we forget a lot, and we've talked about this before, right? For many years, as the evolution of this, the questions of how we see these things and how they're actually playing out, right? So I think a lot of us see it almost as infrastructure now. And so it could be similar to some of the debates about, high-speed internet, as a backbone for the things that we do. That the people that are actually, building out the networks and owning that kind of stuff might have a different view than you do as a user of it. And so I think you're right. I think this was a year where we saw what can happen when, the platform controllers actually have very specific ideas of what they think they want to do with it.
And so I think, Sue, I was thinking about that because it's not something you could predict for the future, but something maybe a want for the future, is everyone was treating it for VGI like it was an infrastructure, often like an OpenStreetMap, that there is a way to create something that is more in line with the use that everyone found so valuable that would support it, so that it wouldn't things like this wouldn't disrupt services that have been developed for it, especially for things like emergency services and stuff like that to reach the public.
And if we look at it from a social perspective, I think in the next year, we're going to see a lot more fracturing of our society's conversations, because, there are issues with Facebook, there are issues with Twitter, but they were these gargantuan places where almost everybody came to have part of the conversation.
It's going from town hall to town halls.
Yes. So we're going from everybody meeting in the amphitheater to everybody staying in the corners of the building and talking to their niche. So, we have things like Mastodon, which has a very social, I'm not going to say socialist, but social kind of identity to it. You have people going to things like Truth, and you've got people who are going to other baseline that we're used to, like Instagram and stuff like that. But it's just, it's going to continue to fracture over the next year, because even within something like Mastodon, you have different servers, and people are going to, stand up different servers that are focused on different areas. And even though you can jump between those in conversations, it's still a fracturing somewhat of the population that's taking advantage of it.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a huge trend this year, and I think it's going to. I feel like it's one of those things that's going to accelerate on a dime. It just suddenly is like, whoa, we radically changed in a very short period of time. Unlike a general evolution, I started off talking about ArcMap going away, which has been going away for 5 years now. Has been going away, and I'm now saying this is the year that I think it finally flipped. But this stuff. This time last year, I don't think that this conversation we just had about social media we would have had 12 months ago. it just very short period of time. It was like, whoa, this changed, and this is going to change. It's now very apparent to everybody exactly how radically this is going to change.
I don't know. I don't see the future anymore. I can barely keep up with the present. So, I think some of the things we've already talked about. So the access to remotely sensed data from cars, data from sensors, data from satellites, that's going to just continue to grow in my mind, and that's awesome. But we've talked many times how we as populations have not been ready for the wealth of data that we have access to now. And that's not just the data, that's also the interpretation of that data from multiple sources, and how we can ingest that in a way that we can stay sane. And I think we're not just seeing that in data in general. Now we're getting to the point where, like I was saying, that's where we are in geospatial. Is how do we figure out where the data is best from now? Because there's so many different sources, and some of them are free, some of them are not free. It's harder to find the ones that aren't free, but they might be the best sources sometimes. So if we're not commercial entities, how do we get access to some of this data that might actually be the best thing to answer the questions that we need to answer? And so it's just an ongoing thing that we've been looking at, but I think it's, for us in the geospatial industry, becoming that much more. And keep in mind, we talk about the geospatial industry as if everything is coming from another geospatial source, but we're not. I mean, some of this data could be described as aspatial, even though there's spatial connections to it. And just getting our minds around some of these things, we have software that we use a lot that is built for a certain thing. And there is this need to continue to see people focusing on coding and working in the open source arena, spending time on GitHub, just finding things that people are putting out there for use to see how they can support us. So whether it's something like new libraries or scripts in R, or whatever the next web-based language is going to be, because we've had Python now for X number of years. It's time for something to start to gain popularity, to push Python out of the way. We know it's coming. What's it going to be?
Well,
and so
JavaScript is hung on well past its expiration date. So don't knock Python out yet. It can hang on for another decade, and everyone goes, really, nothing.
Well, it's not going to be gone.
No, I'm just saying,
going to be something else that's going to sunset it, and it's still going to be there. But
no, I'm saying that JavaScript has shown a remarkable tenacity to be the major sun in the sky, even though there's better things out there. That's my editorial comment. Programmers can email me at frank@veryspatial.com. But and I think Python has the virtue of it being the old crappy tool that everybody knows how to use. And that's what makes it harder for the marketplace to open up for that sort of stuff. But it does lead to questions of sort of related to what you're saying, which is what's not coming along that could push this envelope a little bit further to do some of these things. If these two big behemoths of language don't allow that to happen, it kind of sucks out the oxygen from the programmer error. I'm sorry, I've gone on a tangent.
No. I mean, it's the key to the idea, and so it's where are we going to go with all these things? How can we keep moving forward? And we're going to have to, because there's just so much out there that we need to respond to, that it's not just the same old things year after year that we've kind of been touting. It really is much more of, while we've said everybody else needs to come to us, we do need to go out to them as well. As I think we've said a few times, but we tend to talk about them coming to us as geospatial, as opposed to us as geospatial embracing more.
And I think while you were talking, and you, Frank, but I was reminded of something that we'll probably have to revisit in the coming year. And I think that question of how to utilize all this data, that question of technology kind of being implemented in unexpected ways this year. And so this moves into next year. We saw that debate increasing kind of in the second half of the year over the question of AI, right, in the art space. So the question of, people selling AI generated art images and other things too as well. And so AI has been that thing that we've been watching as part of, data analytics, big data and all that as a way to process just the volumes of data. Of course, we've been looking at machine learning and AI in the geospatial space for things like, processing remotely sensed imagery and other types of things. But this is something too that I think is also kind of playing out in some of the other cases in things like social media, right? The unintended, or perhaps not unintended, but just when it gets out there, you're like, wow, I didn't think of it this way, that, using it in art, then it raises questions about, authorship but it raises those questions. We have these algorithms and things in the background doing that heavy lifting of initial processing of data because we just can't. Then, that might bring, I think in the near future, perhaps a crisis of, how do we decide the legitimacy and questions again that have been brought up before, but I think that's on a track to come to a head in the near future as well.
This is another podcast idea, a future conversation, but we always talk about, well, most geographers talk about the art and science of cartography, or the art and science of GIS, or there's both aspects to it. And I kind of think the way we always conceptualize art is the artistic decisions and map making, very cartographically rich thing. But to kind of restate some of what Jesse was saying is that we as GISers need to, in my opinion, embrace creative use of other tools that aren't spatial in a geospatial context. And I don't think we do that enough as an industry. And I think that is going to be, just as he's saying, going to be an important feature moving forward.
And just to kind of not completely jump from this, but going back to 2022, one of the big things, and Frank started to talk about this with the collapse of crypto, is the question mark of blockchain. And I think last year we said, blockchain is something that's coming. And I don't think it happened as quickly as I expected it to the geospatial. We do have services that allow for blockchain data encryption and sharing. But, between the collapse of crypto, between the realization that NFTs are just NFTs and they have devalued massively this year, I don't think that devalues the blockchain. I don't think it devalues what it can offer for showing who is the owner, who is the authoritative source for a particular data source. But I think it's going to be longer before we really figure out how that's going to work for us. I mean, there's some out there, but it's just not grown as much this year as I really thought it was going to. So it's a question mark of this year. Are we going to see more markets taking advantage of that, or are we not worried about the blockchain block of ownership because we have metadata? Does metadata just overwrite the need for a blockchain connection?
I think it's another good podcast idea, right? But I think that, think about the new datum that's coming out. Is it 22? NAD 22?
Yeah.
It's coming I think it goes
2024 now.
Yeah. But I mean, I think that we as the geospatial industry look at blockchain and just go, oh my God, I have so many other things that I don't really understand that I have to deal with at so many levels. And you're talking about blockchain and machine learning. I don't even know what to do about this stupid NAD thing I know that's coming. And I think that, what we just had the retirement of the U.S. survey foot just officially retired like yesterday. So I kind of feel like you're right. The blockchain is going to be something we should be paying attention to and how to utilize that. And I just feel like it's an area that so many people are just go, I just can't. There's no bandwidth. I'm out.
It shouldn't be individuals dealing with it.
No, yeah, I agree.
It should be, it's a programmatic thing. It needs to be done at that
there
level.
There needs to be nerds out there nerding about blockchain and make it happen, and then just make a thing, and they just go, here's the black box if you want it, and we go, oh, okay, I'll take it. That's what should happen. You're absolutely right, but it's surprising that's not going on.
Well, I think that also all wraps into something that you heard a lot about in 2022, which was geoethics and a focus on geoethics. And I think what Sue and Jesse have been talking about all relate to this overarching idea of geoethics, especially when you're talking outside the geospatial community, but dealing with spatial data and spatial issues. And I see ownership as one of those things that falls within the geoethics of the future.
Yeah, and everything from, so that was the focus. Was it 2020 or 2021's Geography 2050? And of course, there's we saw the round grant that happened back in 2021. But yeah, there's been a big push now that a lot of those first steps were taken in the last couple of years. A big push to really make people aware of what it really means, to look at what we're doing. And again, that shouldn't just be geo focused. That should be across the board in data ethics. And I think, that's a conversation for another day, is whenever people are talking about the various data jobs, analyst, data scientist, whatever category you want to put people into, they just kind of subsume geospatial within that, which is awesome. It's also a little sad that they don't consider us to be data scientists a lot of times, because we don't have that extra little bit of math class that they took or statistics class they took. So I don't know.
Or they don't think we did.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, we've either taken the class or taught it ourselves at this point, probably. So I don't know. I'm a little bitter about not being seen as a data scientist, even though I spend all day working with data.
I'm with you. Because, the techniques that we use are every bit as sophisticated. And if I hear one more statistician say something like, we've controlled for location, I'm going to smack somebody. Because it's just like, you can't get rid of spatial autocorrelation. You just can't. You think you can, but you really can't most of the time. And I'm sorry. I will go off my soapbox there, but I'm with you 100%.
So, yeah. I don't know. Where does that take us for where we see things going in the next year or two? Anything else?
Anybody have? Okay, I'm gonna throw this out there. Nobody else has to take up this gauntlet, but I'm gonna throw out a thing that I'm going to try to do in 2023, is that I would like to embrace this notion of shorts or reels or whatever a little bit, for whatever YouTube calls it, for VerySpatial. So hopefully I'm gonna do that a bit more. It seems a little more accessible to do those, what is it, 30-second, 1 minute things.
1 minute, yeah.
Yeah, and that seems to something that I could reasonably obtain. So I'm hoping that I at least do that more in the coming year, and hopefully we can do others.
It would be nice if we could do one on the opposite weeks from the podcast, and then occasionally, maybe once a month, do a video. But, it just kind of depends on where we go with VerySpatial TV. It's been in a hiatus again for another, 3 years now?
Yeah.
Since the last season?
That's on the VerySpatial side. Hopefully there'll be new projects we can reignite. We've talked about a lot of different things, but VerySpatial TV is certainly the easy one to reignite because it exists.
Yeah. And placegames.org exists as well. So if you want to find out or keep track with where we are going with whatever kind of conference we're going to put on sometime this year, sometime between now and next January, head over to placegames.org. And as we figure out what it will be, because we haven't talked about it yet other than me saying I was going to put up the page, we'll let you know. It could be as early as this summer. It could be as late as the next round of holiday season.
Yeah.
A year from now. Yeah.
So, however, if you have any thoughts on what we should do for Place Games or VerySpatial TV or any other things, how could they reach us?
Podcast at veryspatial.com. In theory. I should read it most of the time. Of course, we don't have any other conferences this week. We just want you to know that there are a ton of them coming up. You should go to all of them that you can, but don't feel you need to go to any of them, especially since a lot of them are putting sessions up online. So even if you don't go to some, head over to YouTube or the conference webpage and check those out. And of course, if you want us to add your event to the podcast in the coming year, podcast at VerySpatial.com.
And of course, that individual access, I can be reached at sue@veryspatial.com. And I'm probably going to be back on some social medias, but we'll hold that off to the new year.
And Barb, it's VerySpatial.com.
You can reach me at frank@veryspatial.com and all the social medias for now at Nojopar.
I'm at Kinda Spatial. And if you want to find any of our contact information, again, still not updated after, a month and a half now of saying that, you can head over to veryspatial.com/contacts.
As always,
We're the folks in VerySpatial.
Thanks for listening.
And we'll see you in a couple weeks.